The train left Zurich at 8:04 in the morning. It arrived in Geneva at 9:56. 179 kilometers, 112 minutes. No delay. Amara Diallo had made this journey 14 times in the 3 years since she arrived in Switzerland from Dakar. She is 34, a compliance officer at a private bank in Geneva, and she still finds something quietly astonishing about the fact that a train this efficient, running through landscape this beautiful, connects two cities where the working language changes completely at some invisible point between Lausanne and the French border, where the announcements shift from Sehr geehrte Fahrgäste to Mesdames et Messieurs, and the conductors switch languages mid-sentence without apparent effort, as if this is the most natural thing in the world, which in Switzerland, it is. In Senegal, she says, we have one language for government and another for home and several others for the market. It is normal. It is how many countries work. She pauses, watching the vineyards of the Lavaux, terraced into the steep slopes above Lake Geneva, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, producing wine that has been grown on these hills since the 12th century, past the window at 200 kilometers per hour. But here it is different. Here the languages are not a problem to be managed. They are the point. They are how the country works. She has been trying to explain this to her family in Dakar for 3 years. She has not fully succeeded. Switzerland is difficult to explain to people who have not been inside it, because so many of the things that make it extraordinary are the things that everywhere else would be considered obstacles. No access to the sea, surrounded by larger, louder, more geographically powerful neighbors. Germany, France, Italy, Austria. No oil, no iron ore, no coal, no empire, historical or contemporary. A population of 8.5 million, smaller than London. 4 official languages, 26 cantons with substantial autonomy. A political system so deliberately decentralized, so structured around consensus and local control and the regular referendum that it should, by conventional political science, be ungovernable. And yet, the train arrives in Geneva at 9:56. Not 9:58, not 10:03, 9:56. That, Amara says, gathering her bag, tells you almost everything. This is a film about what it doesn't tell you, about the systems beneath the punctuality, the financial architecture, the political philosophy, the linguistic miracle, the mountain economy, that have made a country that shouldn't work into one that works better than almost any other on Earth. And about what that means in a century that is going to test every model of how human societies organize themselves, for the rest of us watching from the window. To understand Switzerland, you have to begin with an idea that sounds passive and turns out to be aggressively strategic: neutrality. Swiss neutrality was not always a choice. It began as a necessity. A small, landlocked confederation of mountain cantons surrounded by great powers that were perpetually at war with each other, learning early that the only way to survive in that neighborhood was to refuse to take sides in conflicts that were not theirs to win or lose. The formal declaration of perpetual neutrality came in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna, ratified by the great powers as a solution to the problem of what to do with a territory that everyone needed to pass through and no one quite wanted to fight over. But neutrality, sustained across 2 centuries, becomes something more than a defensive posture. It becomes a brand, an infrastructure, a comparative advantage that compounds over time. When European powers went to war in 1914, Switzerland did not. When they went to war again in 1939, Switzerland did not. While the continent destroyed its financial institutions, its legal frameworks, its industrial capacity, and its human capital in 2 successive catastrophes, Switzerland maintained all of these things, imperfectly, with compromises that history has judged harshly in some cases, but maintained. The banks kept functioning, the courts kept ruling, the trains kept running, even through the darkest years. because the Alpine passes were too valuable to all sides to risk destroying. The result, by 1945, was a country that had inherited, by accident of geography and strategy, the institutional infrastructure of a continent. The financial systems, the legal traditions, the precision manufacturing, the watchmaking, the pharmaceutical chemistry, all of it intact while the neighbors rebuilt from rubble. Geneva became what it became, the home of the International Red Cross, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations Office, hundreds of international NGOs and treaty bodies, and diplomatic missions. Not because Switzerland sought global leadership in the conventional sense, but because a neutral country with functioning institutions and no particular enemies is the only kind of place that all parties to a conflict can agree to use as common ground. This is neutrality as economic model, and it has worked with a consistency that makes it the envy of smaller countries everywhere, even if the model cannot be replicated, because you cannot simply decide to have been neutral for 200 years. It is, like the best comparative advantages, largely historical and therefore largely irreproducible. Amara understood this before she arrived. She understood it better after 3 years inside it. Everyone thinks Switzerland is rich because of the banks, she says, but the banks are rich because of Switzerland, because of what Switzerland decided to be very long ago and never stopped being. Switzerland's economy is, in its structural logic, one of the most interesting in the world, not because it is the largest or the most dynamic, but because it has found ways to be extraordinarily valuable in domains where size confers no advantage and where the things that matter most are accumulated over generations rather than built in quarters. It runs on 3 engines that look, from the outside, almost impossibly refined. The first is private banking and financial services, but the real story is what money needs. Switzerland manages approximately 7.5 trillion Swiss francs in offshore wealth, roughly a third of all privately managed cross-border assets in the world. This figure is so large relative to the country's size that it constitutes, in effect, a parallel economy sitting alongside the visible one. Zurich and Geneva are not merely financial centers in the way that Frankfurt or Amsterdam are financial centers. They are repositories, places where wealth from across the world is held, managed, structured, and protected by an industry that has spent 2 centuries learning exactly what wealthy people and wealthy institutions need. What they need, it turns out, is not simply returns. Returns are available in many places. What they need, at the level of truly significant wealth, is stability, discretion, legal predictability, political neutrality, and the confidence that the rules governing their assets today will still be governing them in 20 years. Switzerland provides all of these things with a consistency that its competitors, Singapore, Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, Dubai, have approached but not fully replicated. The private banking model has evolved significantly. The era of strict banking secrecy, the numbered account, the absolute confidentiality that made Swiss banking famous and occasionally notorious, is substantially over. Eroded by international pressure, OECD frameworks, and bilateral agreements that have made tax evasion through Swiss accounts far more difficult than it once was. The Swiss banking industry has adapted, professionalizing its compliance infrastructure, developing expertise in sustainable finance, family office management, and the structuring of complex international assets that requires the kind of multi-jurisdictional legal knowledge that only a country genuinely operating in 4 languages and multiple legal traditions can easily develop. Amara's job is part of this adaptation. She spends her days ensuring that the bank's client relationships meet the increasingly demanding international standards for anti-money laundering, tax transparency, and beneficial ownership disclosure. It is, she says, the opposite of the industry's old reputation. People think we are hiding things, she says. Mostly we are doing paperwork to prove that we are not hiding things. She smiles. There is more paperwork than you might imagine. The second engine is pharmaceutical and chemical industry, Switzerland's least glamorous and most important sector. Novartis and Roche, both headquartered in Basel, are two of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Together, they generate revenues of roughly 120 billion Swiss francs per year, employ tens of thousands of researchers globally, and produce medicines that treat conditions from cancer to multiple sclerosis to rare genetic diseases. The Swiss pharmaceutical sector as a whole, including Lonza, which manufactures biological drugs for other companies, and the specialty chemical sector that grew from the same 19th century dye industry roots, accounts for roughly half of Swiss goods exports by value. This concentration of pharmaceutical excellence in a small country is not accidental. It reflects a century of investment in chemistry education, in research institutions, in the kind of patient, long-term corporate culture that pharmaceutical development requires. Drug development timelines measured in decades, not quarters, and in the regulatory environment of a country that takes both intellectual property protection and scientific rigor seriously. The Basel model, a city where Novartis and Roche face each other across the Rhine, competing for the same talent, generating the same kind of dense innovation ecosystem that Silicon Valley generates in software, is one of the few genuine examples of a knowledge cluster that cannot be easily relocated. The accumulated expertise, the university connections, the supplier ecosystem, the regulatory knowledge, the institutional memory, all of it is rooted in a place in ways that make the comparative advantage genuinely durable. The third engine is the one tourists come for, but the real product is not the mountain. Switzerland receives approximately 39 million international visitors per year, extraordinary for a country of 8.5 million, and has built, over generations, a tourism infrastructure of such quality that the experience of being in Switzerland has become, in itself, a product worth paying significant premium for. But the Swiss understanding of tourism is different from the Spanish or Italian model. Switzerland does not sell volume, it sells precision. The ski resort that opens exactly when it says it will open, with exactly the snow conditions it advertised, with exactly the service standards the guest was promised. The hotel that has been run by the same family for 4 generations and considers its reputation a more important asset than any single season's revenue. The mountain railway, the Jungfraubahn, the Gornergrat, the Pilatus, the Rigi, built by engineers in the 19th century and maintained to standards that make the infrastructure of many modern countries look careless. This precision tourism is connected to something deeper in Swiss economic culture. The conviction that quality is a long-term asset and that compromising it for short-term revenue is always a losing calculation. The watch industry, Rolex, Patek Philippe, IWC, Omega, Breitling, operates on the same logic. The watches cost what they cost, not primarily because of their materials, but because of what they represent. The accumulated credibility of an industry that has been making things with extraordinary care for a very long time and has never, collectively, decided that close enough is good enough. The tourists who come to Zermatt or Grindelwald or St. Moritz are buying into this logic without necessarily articulating it. They are paying not just for the mountain, mountains exist in many countries, but for the Swiss relationship with the mountain. The relationship that says, we have thought carefully about how to make this experience excellent. We have invested in the infrastructure to deliver it, and we will deliver it the same way every time. There is a question that political scientists have been trying to answer about Switzerland for 2 centuries without fully succeeding. How does it hold together? 4 official languages. 31% of the resident population are foreign nationals, the highest proportion of any major European country. 26 cantons with their own constitutions, tax rates, school systems, and substantial legislative powers. A federal government whose executive is a 7-member council that operates by consensus rather than majority, that has no prime minister, and that rotates its presidency annually among its members as a deliberate act of institutional modesty. By every conventional theory of nation building, this should produce fragmentation, paralysis, or both. Instead, it produces the country that Amara rides across in 112 minutes on a train that arrives at 9:56. The explanation, insofar as one exists, has several components. The first is subsidiarity taken seriously. Switzerland does not merely pay lip service to the idea that decisions should be made at the lowest possible level of government. It actually organizes itself this way. The canton of Zug has different tax rates from the canton of Vaud. The canton of Ticino teaches in Italian, while the canton of Zurich teaches in German. The commune of Appenzell-Innerrhoden practiced direct democracy in the original sense. The Landsgemeinde, the open-air assembly of citizens who vote by raising their hands, until very recently. This genuine diversity within a small space requires Swiss citizens to develop a practical tolerance for difference that many larger, more homogeneous countries have never needed to cultivate. The second is the referendum. Switzerland uses direct democracy more extensively than any other country in the world. Federal referendums, cantonal referendums, communal referendums, the Swiss vote, on average, 4 times per year on a range of issues, from constitutional amendments to local planning decisions. This is slow. It is sometimes frustrating. Reformers find it difficult to change things quickly because any significant change can be put to a popular vote and rejected. But it produces something valuable, a political system in which citizens feel genuinely consulted, in which the legitimacy of decisions is grounded in direct participation rather than delegation, and in which the social contract is renewed continuously through the act of voting. The third component is harder to name, but easier to feel inside the country. It is something like a shared commitment to the idea that Switzerland works, that the system, for all its complexity, is worth maintaining because the alternative is worse. A country that has seen, from its Alpine vantage point, what happens to countries that abandon their institutions, has developed a particular appreciation for institutional continuity. But the miracle has cracks, and the cracks are widening. Swiss house prices have risen faster than almost anywhere in Europe over the past decade. Zurich and Geneva consistently rank among the 5 most expensive cities in the world. The young Swiss professional, educated, skilled, born into a country that is by many measures the best place on earth to live, faces a housing market that their parents' generation would not recognize. In a country where wages are high, but where the costs of living are high enough to make the arithmetic of a comfortable life genuinely challenging. The foreign national population, that 31%, is in practice stratified in ways that the elegant multicultural image of Switzerland tends to obscure. The highly skilled international professionals, the bankers and pharmaceutical researchers and tech workers, are welcomed with efficiency and housed in the better functioning parts of the market. The low-wage workers, in construction, in cleaning, in care, in hospitality, are present in large numbers, legally permitted to work, but often housed in peripheral communes, less connected to the civic culture, less visible in the public discourse about what Switzerland is and values. And the banking industry faces structural pressures that the collapse of Credit Suisse in 2023 made brutally visible. The merger of Credit Suisse into UBS, a transaction conducted over a weekend by the Swiss government and central bank with a speed that rather contradicted the country's reputation for deliberate decision-making, was not the end of Swiss banking. UBS remains one of the world's largest wealth managers. The Swiss financial center remains the most significant private banking hub on earth. But it was a reminder that size and complexity in financial institutions create fragility that national reputation alone cannot protect against. The Swiss banking miracle, like all miracles, has its terms and conditions. Amara thinks about this in her daily work. She thinks about the distance between the Switzerland that the world imagines, the chocolate, the watches, the punctual trains, the numbered accounts, and the Switzerland she operates inside, more bureaucratic, more contested, more aware of its own fragility than the image suggests. Every country has a myth, she says. Switzerland's myth is closer to reality than most, but it is still a myth. The trains are on time, but the people on the trains are working very hard to keep them that way. She pauses. That's the part the postcards don't show. Switzerland is not finished. It is, in a sense, the opposite of finished. It is one of the few countries in the world whose model appears genuinely durable, genuinely refined, and genuinely difficult to replicate. The pharmaceutical sector is investing in the next generation of biological medicines, gene therapies, and personalized treatments that will define healthcare in the coming decades. Swiss universities, ETH Zurich, EPFL in Lausanne, the University of Basel, consistently rank among the top research institutions in the world and produce the scientists who will staff those industries. The financial sector is adapting to new regulatory realities while maintaining the institutional depth that cannot be built quickly elsewhere. The tourism infrastructure, maintained with the patient investment of a country that takes quality seriously, continues to attract visitors who are willing to pay for the experience of being in a place where things work. The green energy transition offers Switzerland something it has not always been positioned to exploit. The country is already 60% powered by hydroelectricity, generated by the same Alpine geography that draws the tourists and challenged the engineers of the 19th century. The expansion of solar capacity, of battery storage, of the grid connections that will make Switzerland a net exporter of clean electricity to its neighbors is underway. A country that built its identity around precision and long-term thinking is perhaps better placed than most to make the investments that the energy transition requires. The question that Switzerland faces is not existential, it is refinement. How do you maintain a model this successful while adapting it to a world where banking secrecy is no longer possible, where pharmaceutical supply chains are being reshaped by geopolitical competition, where the housing market is testing the social contract with the generation that will inherit the institutions, and where the linguistic and cultural diversity that is Switzerland's greatest strength is also its greatest management challenge? It is, in the end, the question that all successful systems eventually face. How do you stay excellent after you have already become excellent? On a Friday afternoon, Amara Diallo takes the train back from Geneva to Zurich. The vineyards of the Lavaux pass the window again, terraced into the slope above the lake, catching the October light at an angle that makes them look painted. The lake is flat and gray-blue and enormous. The Alps begin at its far shore and rise into a sky that is, on this particular afternoon, entirely clear. At some point between Lausanne and Bern, at the invisible line where French becomes German without ceremony, where the conductor switches languages mid-sentence, and the announcements change and the country changes without changing, Amara looks up from her laptop. She looks at the Alps. She thinks about a conversation she had in Dakar, before she left, with her grandmother. Her grandmother had asked why she was going to Switzerland. Amara had explained the job, the salary, the opportunity. Her grandmother had nodded. "But what is it like there?" she had asked. "As a place?" Amara had not known how to answer then. She thinks she knows now. "It is like a watch," she writes in her notebook, "complicated inside, simple outside, precise in ways that seem unnecessary until something goes wrong and you understand that the precision was the whole point." She looks at the Alps again, and very, very hard to make, but once made, almost impossible to break. The train arrives in Zurich at 17:43, on time. Of course,